Hi, my name is Alark Saxena, and I'm the Program Director for Yale Himalaya Initiative. Today, we have Mr. Austin Lord, who is the Executive Director of a voluntary organization called Raswa Relief. Austin is also an alum of the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. Welcome, Austin.
Thank you, Alark. It's good to be here.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about your work and what you've been up to.
Well, as you know, I just arrived 2.5 days ago from Kathmandu. I've been based there since I completed my master's degree at Yale School of Forestry, and I had been doing field work there a couple of years prior to that. Currently, and the topic that I spoke upon mostly yesterday was relative to the earthquakes of 2015. The way that I situated that within my ongoing research, which is regarding infrastructure development, particularly hydropower development, and planning, and issues of governance, particularly environmental governance. And then I spoke at length sort of about the different roles that I've played and the different scales that I've participated in the post-disaster period. So you mentioned Rasua Relief, which is to be clear, is a volunteer humanitarian initiative, which is to say it's not truly an NGO. It's something that started at the grassroots level immediately after the earthquake, and it began as a very direct result of my own experience at the time of the earthquake, being in the Langtang Valley, which was an extremely hard-hit area. You can learn more in all sorts of media about it, but it was a massive avalanche that was triggered that buried an entire village and killed upwards of 300 people. I had just departed immediately prior that morning, 2 hours. I was still in the valley at the time, only 4 kilometers away at the time of the event. So at the time of the earthquake, I was in the Langtang Valley, which is in north-central Nepal. I was in the middle of kind of just a personal trip. My family was visiting around the time of my wedding, and we went to the Langtang Valley because it's a place that I know well and a place that I appreciate. A couple days into our trip, we were on our way down. We had just left the village of Langtang, where the night before we spent the night before in Langtang village itself, and we had actually participated in this funerary ceremony at the local gomba, or the local monastery. It was quite beautiful, and we had an amazing trip. And just on the morning of April 25th, 2 hours after we left the village, the earthquake struck, and the entire village was buried by a massive avalanche. It was an extremely tragic event. It's colored a great deal of my experience and engagement since the earthquake, and there's upwards of 300 people were killed during the event. So that's how the earthquake and the post-earthquake period implicated me. And from that moment onward, I did my best in the immediate days to help maintain a sense of calm, set up a simple triage system for the people who were stranded in the area. I myself wasn't evacuated for about 60 hours after the earthquake. It was an extremely terrifying time, the aftershocks and landslides and just uncertainty about what would happen. And when we got back to Kathmandu, I tried my best to get information to figure out what I should do next, to figure out more about the area surrounding Langtang, which is a district called Rasua, which is where Rasua Relief comes from. And after getting to Kathmandu and finding my bearings and connecting with the outside world, myself and a few close friends, colleagues, Galen Merton and Bob Beasley, who were also fellow Fulbright scholars at the time, we started this initiative in Rasua, which was an area where there hadn't been a great deal of response at that time, called Rasua Relief. And we brought in other different friends of ours with experience in the area, and we created this volunteer organization, which has been an incredible experience, but also learning by doing.
Could you tell us a little bit about when you arrived in Kathmandu? What was the response? Describe the situation in which government and other NGOs was trying to operate in terms of this extreme event?
So, as I said, I was out of contact for the first 60 hours. When I first arrived in Kathmandu, I feared for the worst, actually, given what I had seen and experienced in Langtang for what Kathmandu would be like. I was lucky enough to get one call out to my wife via a local satellite phone that later went dead because of solar issues. But when I arrived, I was amazed and very happy to learn that the destruction of the city was in pockets. I wrote on my experience with social media has also changed as a result of the earthquake. I was in contact with different people around the world trying to help them identify where their family members might be who were in Langtang. I immediately, partly due to my parents being with me at the time, we checked in with the embassy, and a bunch of my Fulbright colleagues were basically manning the phones at the embassy and trying to help the embassy track down and respond to people from abroad who were searching for their loved ones. Having been in Langtang, I also had literally a list with me that I handed off and called in to the different embassies of which Israelis were still in Langtang, who had survived, which people from Australia, people from Slovenia, people from England, France, a number of different locations. So immediately things, and this is kind of what I spoke to last night, immediately things went from this highly localized experience in the Langtang Valley to the global perspective. Shortly after I got back, I actually got on the phone with the former director of the Yale Himalaya Initiative, Mark Turin, and Mark himself, being a very active node in a network of information, said, the world is watching, and it's your responsibility to do everything you can. So as Mark at the same time was translating the Facebook Mark Say function into Nepali and doing amazing work, we just sort of started with what we knew. And what I knew was Langtang and Rasua. So after getting back and getting situated and finding out Langtang's place in the post-earthquake world, I went to a couple of high-level meetings in Kathmandu where humanitarian responders and military responders and others were sort of sharing information and trying to determine ways forward and coordination mechanisms. At the meetings that happened there, we were going around and I was seeking more information about Rasua and came to the realization with my colleagues that not many of the immediate responders knew that area well, nor was there a lot of activity information. So we found ourselves at the meeting we thought we would be learning, we found ourselves sharing information. And from that point forward, we began the process of, and we were careful because our intention was never to become an NGO, nor have we become an NGO. But before we acted, we wanted to make sure there was a need and a gap. And I think, carefully decided that there was a gap and that we, whether we liked it or not, were some of the people who could help fill that in the immediate. So we did a lot of our own direct actions. We did a lot of coordination with other NGOs. We informed and briefed and recommended to a number of responding NGOs once more groups started to make their way into Rasua. But it was, at the time that we started, it was an area that was already overlooked, and we were trying to think at a sub-district level, at a local, micro-political level. Having done research in that area for years, we knew the human and the physical geography. We had some sense of the politics of the situation, and we kind of knew what areas might be overlooked and where you might wanna do an additional level of diligence. So that's where we started, and that's how our little organization, which has ranged from 5 people to 11 people and back to 7 and now up closer to 9 or 10 people. Mostly volunteers, all foreign volunteers, a few Nepalis who work with us who are sort of program field managers. But all these titles they originate from within because we're a volunteer organization.
Right.
That's how our little organization started and how it articulates with these bigger scales.
So you were talking about this kind of local to the global, and that and kind of reflecting on Mark saying
quick acceleration.
Yeah, quick acceleration, and also that Mark saying that the world is watching, and kind of finding yourself in this gap where you were essentially providing information or becoming a platform where information could be exchanged. Could you talk a little bit more about, in this case, the idea of how in these countries, especially in the Himalayan region now, social media is coming as kind of a main platform. Where is it right now? How is it going to be in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I was only a casual user of social media, so some might disagree with that, but as a person living abroad, I use social media at a personal level just to stay in touch with people. And I, promoted academic events, so to speak, and shared information and followed things. But after the earthquake, it was amazing at the scale of Nepal, and also around the world, how many people sort of tuned in. How many people who barely had Facebook accounts or didn't have Facebook accounts found out or realized that it was necessary to get the best information to be on Facebook because Nepalis were on Facebook. The fact that I was on Facebook was just a byproduct. In fact, that people started following information that I had shared, starting with Langtang, and then I shared a post saying, like, Kathmandu is not a pile of rubble. Do not believe what you see. There are areas that are hard hit, but it's the depiction and the focus should be out in quote unquote the villages, which other scholars more senior than myself also said on social media and other forums. It was a fantastic pulse of activity and information, and there are other volunteer organizations that used it very well and use it in really creative ways. And there's multiple things here. It's a historical moment, I think. It's truly I've been working in Nepal for almost 4 years. In the time that I've been there, the penetration, so to speak, of social media spatially into areas where people weren't using smartphones just a few years ago. Even if they don't have service where they live, they will, when they're sort of moving up and down river corridors and going to school and migrating locally for jobs, sometimes people, they're cycling in and out of connection and they make sure to check things. It's remarkable to see the level of activity, and from my own perspective, I'll get to this later hopefully, the Langtang themselves, who live in quite a remote area, having been in Kathmandu since having been displaced and having been in Kathmandu for months now, they've been doing really interesting things on their own with social media, which is teaching me more about the ways that people use this and innovative sort of sociality in a virtual realm that recreate. It's fascinating. But in the disaster response sense, I think this is a new moment because. And it's contested whether or not this is a major disaster on a global scale. But the level of response was major, and the level of connectivity was major. This has something to do with the unique charismatic quality, I guess, of Nepal. But if you look at the trends of recent disasters, and you look at places like Haiti, which has had incredible outpouring of effort afterwards, but the coordination mechanisms were different. Social media played a role, but it wasn't so fully developed, particularly in Haiti at the time, that you didn't see these self-organizing mechanisms. In Nepal, for example, at the time, there's another group. Rasul Relief is a small organization, non-organization. Yellow House, or what's popularly called Yellow House, otherwise known as the Himalayan Disaster Relief Volunteer Group, was another social media-oriented group that was started by friends, initially focused on Lalitpur in South Kathmandu, and then spread much wider. It was just a group of people who had different skill sets who came together through social media and then in person, and then put the call out and found resources and linked people and identified needs, not just using social media, also mobile phones and personal contacts. But this particular group, which was a volunteer initiative, ended up being the 4th largest distributor of relief materials in the immediate emergency phase, however defined. So it's amazing that this group was able to make themselves active, and then make themselves visible, channel resources to them as people became aware, and then distribute them effectively. And the role of social media was massive within that effort. I'm about to go to Dartmouth tomorrow, and on Friday I'll be talking on a panel about social media and social entrepreneurship in the context of the Nepal earthquake at the Dartmouth Nepal Earthquake Summit. And this particular, I think it's something new under the sun. I think it's really exciting. Seeing things like QuakeMap, which is a crowdsourced disaster mapping platform that came up by Kathmandu Living Labs, an organization I'd worked with before the earthquake and after. Seeing initiatives that came up like QuakeMap, seeing this, there's another project called the #Nepal Photo Project, which is just a way of sort of creating a visual community of contributors of photographs in the wake of the earthquake. Not just damage, also, recovery, resilience, other human themes. Just amazing ways for people to stay, to facilitate coordination, distribution efforts, activity, but also as the media has turned, as the general media has shifted away from Kathmandu, these things have been really important to maintain more long-term contacts with people to communicate the idea that the disaster is not over. So it was both the burst of activity was phenomenal, but the way in which some of these things have been consistent and maintained continuity, I think, is surprising. And Rasua Relief, for example, we still exist mostly in Rasua and on Facebook.
Right.
And we only have 1,500, 1,600 members who actively follow and participate. Others may be aware in different ways, but it's still functioning as a way to follow and gain access to decent information, so to speak, that doesn't come through official channels.
Right.
And people value it, it seems.
Absolutely.
We're not the only one out there, importantly. There are lots of there are other individuals who use Facebook that are on Twitter, they're on Facebook. Mark and others included, Prashant Jha, for example, on the issues of the blockade. It's been a real learning curve for me to become more involved and to understand the way that these tools can be used. It's exciting. But it's new sorry to go on, but it's new in the sense that we'll see, and I hope that in the disasters to come, that the lessons learned and some of the systems and the innovation and the entrepreneurial attitude that was demonstrated, again, strongly from within Nepal, I hope that some of those lessons can be taken up and can inform future efforts, because it really creates a new grassroots scale that official disaster response agencies could tap into and could acknowledge and could work with.
Right.
And if you're thinking about preparedness and you're thinking about resilience for future disasters, building up the capacity of local, so to speak, domestic, local, however you want to say, national institutions at the site of a disaster, building up the capacity of institutions to create these self-organizing mechanisms and to use tools like social media and crowdsourcing prior to the earthquake. This is, I think, a really important form of preparedness.
Right. Yeah, and we can see that moments where community wants to come together, and it could be issues of disasters, but it could be, for example, mobilization of people for certain other issues, call for action. Really, social medias have become very significant. We saw this, for example, in India against corruption activities, where social media was used extremely, heavily, and groups came together which were otherwise not possible to happen. So that's great. Kind of shifting a little bit of their conversation.
And frankly, there's an application for social media and that type of post-earthquake governance now in the reconstruction phase. Let's see how that won't be leading the effort, but let's see how that goes. Because it's possible that social media would be a great way to ensure accountability and transparency in the reconstruction process as like a monitoring mechanism. Some kind of social media, maybe not Facebook.
So in that sense, you brought in a couple of points, partly in the sense of disasters, right? And we mentioned this in the talk as well, that earthquakes don't kill, buildings, or falling buildings, or poor constructed buildings kill, landslides kill, and to add on further, it's people placed in these vulnerable or rather uncertain conditions is basically what leads to these impacts. So you want to elaborate a little bit more on that, especially from both Langtang's perspective, or even more from Kathmandu's perspective, of how there was differential vulnerability, if I may call it, where there are some pockets that were absolutely fine and then others were completely devastated.
Yeah, so on the topic of scale, which was one of the sort of framing thinking tools that I was trying to use yesterday in my talk, social scale is extremely important, and social scale informs spatial scale and temporal scale. So if you think spatially in Kathmandu, with the caveat that there's no clear way to predict which part of the the Kathmandu Valley might respond, or how the wave pattern will manifest in the Kathmandu Valley on any particular earthquake. There were some areas that were harder hit than others. So that is the first thought, is, you have neighborhoods like Gungabu, where I used to live, that were disproportionately, the ground movement in these areas was disproportionate to other areas, and that's just a function of how the wave pattern, the seismic pattern, articulates with the surrounding geology. And then Kathmandu is built on this massive deposition of silt from a prior glacial lake, and it moves very strangely in unpredictable patterns. And there's this liquefaction process that could go on in large scale earthquakes. Anyway, science aside, in Gungabu's hit very hard, right? Our house, to be reflexive, our house in Gungabu, which, meaning my family's house, my wife is Nepali, who you know, our family house was built immediately following the 2001 earthquake that struck Gujarat. So at that time, my father-in-law was aware of the fact that the exposure and vulnerability to an earthquake and seismic activity was possible, and had the means at the time to build better. And to prepare and to use reinforced concrete and higher quality building materials, and was very vigilant in the process, to the contractor's disappointment, perhaps. So that house was built very well. So that house is in Gungabu. When the earthquake hit Gungabu, many 6, 8 story buildings, which were built beyond the building code and beyond what was actually permitted, pancaked and collapsed, fell into each other. In some cases, you have 3 slabs just stacked on top of each other. What was once an 8-story building is now a 5-story building. You wouldn't be able to tell unless you walked around the corner and looked at the foundation, but it's just completely collapsed inward. It's frightening. In that same neighborhood, our house stood, and we have it's a school at the current moment, and there are 150 people living in the yard immediately after the earthquake, because it was one of the few open spaces in that area. It's a small yard, 150 people is a lot. But nonetheless, that area had been built up fast, had been built up by a lot of in-migrants to Kathmandu for multiple reasons, one of them being the long-term, the Maoist conflict that went on for a decade, that forced a lot of people, not forced, but compelled people to move into the city. This neighborhood grew up very quickly, and when anything grows quickly, the appropriate and inappropriate rate of growth is up for debate, but corners are cut. On the urban fringes of Kathmandu, Gungabu being an example of one area, this rapid rate of growth creates accentuated conditions of vulnerability. Working quickly with building materials, not using the correct mix of cement, not using correctly washed sand, there are all sorts of structural issues that play in. So wave patterns, structural issues aside, however, there are long-term patterns of social inequity that affect who has the ability to build well, that affect who might be living in a marginal space, who might be living in between in an informal settlement that's sandwiched in between 2 very suspect buildings. How many people are crowded into a particular area, means of egress, issues like that. And these long-term patterns of social exclusion and structural inequality that arise in South Asia and in Nepal more specifically from issues of gender, caste, ethnicity, and class make some people far more vulnerable to the effects of the earthquake. The same applies if you leave the Kathmandu Valley and you go to areas where people are living in marginal landscapes in dry stack, stone houses, or just building with simple mud and concrete. It's the typical way of building, but nonetheless, even if everyone in a particular area builds with the traditional building pattern, some buildings are just poorly built, more poorly built than others, and then some are in areas that are more exposed to flood, that are more exposed, they're marginal agricultural areas, they don't have arable land, so they're steeper, which means they're more exposed to landslides. Throughout sort of the mid-hills and northern watersheds of Nepal, not necessarily the mountains, but in these areas where you get the mixing between the hill region and the mountain region, you have it's not perfectly explanatory, but you have this spatial organization based on ethnicity in many cases, where you have, high caste Hindus living in lands where there are higher quality agricultural lands, where there's more access to markets and public services, and then you have, for example, Tamang, people in Rasua or Nuwakot living in marginal spaces that are just more challenging on a number of levels and are more distant, if not remote. So this is an important point, and one I brought up yesterday, in that since the earthquake, a few scholars, both Nepali, Mukta Singh Lama, Deepak Thapa, and foreign scholars, Catherine March and David Holmberg, my two advisors at Cornell, all have been using this term, the Tam Saling tragedy, to talk about the earthquake. And that gets into issues of narration, which are extremely important when it comes to disaster. So a lot of people have referred to this earthquake as the Gorkha earthquake. And the Gorkha earthquake means that the epicenter was in Gorkha. That's not to say that the highest level of damage or the highest concentration of casualties was in Gorkha. The highest concentration of casualties was in Langtang, actually. Inarguably, I'm not saying that it's more important than other places, and I'm not saying it's the epicenter, but to some people, that was one of the most affected areas. The people of Langtang are sort of their own unique corner of Tamang ethnicity. They're classified as Tamang in the official census sort of records. They have a very culturally Tibetan local society, and they have extremely Tibetan Buddhist Bayul status in their daily practice, and the language that they speak is much closer to Tibetan than Tamang. But most of Rasua, overall, the area where we work, is Tamang. It's the highest density of Tamang anywhere, in any political district in Nepal. I think it's 82 or 83% Tamang overall, which is significant. There's only about 40,000 people in Rasua. But the point of the Tam Saling tragedy, and classifying it that way, is to say that Tam Saling is an idea, first of all. Right now, Nepal is talking about, it's an open and contentious process and of negotiation right now, but Nepal is trying to create a federalist system and delineate states or provinces within Nepal. Naming those provinces and delineating the boundaries of those provinces is what's highly contentious. Tam Saling is the name of hypothetically a Tamang-oriented or a state where Tamang people comprise a majority. And how the lines of that are drawn are important and different. There are other proposals that, they're talking about Tamawan, which is another variation on it. But talking about Tam Saling, if you were to look at the proposals for the federal state of Tam Saling, it includes many of the most hard-hit areas. So to code and label the earthquake as being a tragedy that struck this particular region, which has a certain mix of ethnic identity, is also to say that the Tamang people were disproportionately affected by this earthquake, which is absolutely the case. When you look at the number of casualties, when you look at just spatially the amount of area that was affected, where Tamang residences, but particularly the number of casualties, because the lands, like you were saying, earthquakes don't kill people, buildings kill people, landslides kill people, and Tamangs, both in rural areas and in Kathmandu, are disproportionately, along with other marginalized groups like Dalit and a number of other ethnic minority Janajati groups, were exposed to more risk both in districts, so to speak, outside of the city, and in Kathmandu, for a number of different reasons. So this is an important distinction, I think, that they've made in saying that the Tam Saling tragedy, it means something to talk about it in this way, and it implies that, again, disasters are socially embedded.
Right.
The risks are socially delineated.
Right. So that's
a long answer. Sorry.
No, that's okay. I wanted to bring some attention more, as you kind of hinted upon, was this idea of the development or the making of the Constitution and the political process that's gone around. Could you speak a little bit about that process, how that has been affected by the disaster, at the same time how that might be affecting now the relief or impacting the relief and recovery processes, and maybe the things that have unfolded around that.
I can try.
It's a big question.
There's at least 4 PhD dissertations in that question, and I know some of the people who are writing them, thankfully. But essentially, at the simplest level, the constitutional process has been drawn out. for 7 years. After the deposition, after the People's Movement, the first Constituent Assembly elections, the deposition of the monarchy, there's been this long-term process of trying to draft a constitution, which is the point of a Constituent Assembly. However, the Constituent Assembly that was first elected in 2008 was later disbanded. When I began my field work in Nepal, there was no seated central government. There was a couple, there was a prime minister who was the chief justice who had been shifted over, and there was a couple of ministries, but the actual legislative body and the parliament, so to speak, or the Constituent Assembly did not exist. 2013, there was another election, CA2, so to speak, Constituent Assembly 2. So the first Constituent Assembly dissolved, and they had to reconstruct it, and that process was both lengthy and it led to some political shifts. There was this groundswell kind of greater participation from minority parties, minority groups in the first Constituent Assembly elections in 2008. In 2013, that changed back in a way. Not to say that it regressed, but it shifted, the balance of power shifted back closer to what it was before for the major parties and some of the more dominant groups. So this was the context in which things were supposedly moving towards the Constitution at the time of the earthquake. April 25th, 2015, the earthquake occurred. Second earthquake occurred on May 12th, 2015. June 2015, I think maybe it was the 25th, or not the 25th, perhaps, I can't remember exact date. In June, they had this massive donor conference, which was based on a post-disaster needs assessment. Donors from all over the world, development agencies, countries, all participated and pledged in their own part to the reconstruction and the disaster response in Nepal. $4.4 billion in total, with some other different ways you can account for things, depending upon in-kind, or there's lots of issues. But all this money came in, and one of the things that these other organizations wanted, and people I won't say outside, but other interests have wanted in Nepal for a long time, is greater political stability. Not to favor any particular party, but just a more stable arrangement. The Constitution is seen as a way to deliver that. So it's not that the foreign donors pressured the government to do so, but I think in order to realize some of those pledges, in order to begin the work of things like the National Reconstruction Authority, which is still forming as we speak, you needed a more solid state. And as remarkably, and in some senses regrettably, the process seems to be greatly accelerated after the earthquake for moving towards the Constitution. At the time, the Nepali Congress and the Prime Minister was from the Nepali Congress Party, and they had a grasp on the majority of seats. After they wrote the Constitution, things shifted over to the current Prime Minister, KP Oli, who is from the UML party, which is a separate party. But in the mix there, all the parties sort of agreed that it was time to move forward with the Constitution, in a sense. Now, that's not to say in absolute terms all the parties, because as the Constitution accelerated and they moved, the comment period was quite short. There was a lot of regressive language, and I feel comfortable saying that, of sort of like diluting some of the progressive reforms that were debatable in the Constitution. And there was also a lot of pushing things for future discussion, particularly around the delineation of states, which is extremely important to populations living in the southern plains, that from a social, political, and a spatial perspective have been marginalized over the years, but yet are increasingly large demographic and want more representation. So when the Constitution was fast-tracked, so to speak, there was protests, a series of protests, at a number of levels from civil society, and there was issues, sort of gender bias issues and citizenship rights that many have spoken on quite intelligently. I would point to looking at what they've said, but essentially this Constitution that was arrived so quickly that many were happy to receive was also extremely controversial, and that provoked certain kinds of backlash and political activism and mobilizations in the plains and the Terai, or what's called the Madesh, and it spiraled into violence for a number of different reasons, mistakes made by all sides. And then that led to this political quagmire, which was then referred to as the unofficial blockade, where depending upon who you talk to, India expressed solidarity with some of these minority groups working in the southern plains for greater recognition, mobilization, and political representation. And because of partly of protests and mobilizations by these groups at the border on the Nepal side, and also some sort of, depending upon, again, who you talk to, political engineering or concern by Indian commercial business interests about trade corridors, about the safety of their assets, of their trucks, and the viability of moving fuel over through these contested areas. The border became stuck. And I think it's so complex, and it's just now slowly been resolved. The consequences of that for reconstruction, which I'll come to in a moment, are immense. And is an extremely it's just another disaster on top of some of the earlier of the natural disaster. And it's been extremely, the experience of that blockade has also been extremely uneven. Again, to say that disasters don't fall evenly over a population. In Kathmandu, if you were well off and you had political connections, you could get around the blockade. You could get around the fuel crisis. The black market slowly turned into a black economy. The government, in a way, condoned the black economy. It was nationalistic to engage in the black market so as to support the people of Nepal in their time of need. For my own particular interest in terms of hydropower development, the discourse of energy security became ascendant again, whereas the earthquake maybe questioned certain types of building and certain types of policies related to energy infrastructure and supply. The blockade then sort of consumed people's imagination, and now they're very the discourse has changed, and actually seismic risk and the reality of the earthquakes, which was not so long ago, has been sidelined. So that's interesting. It's a separate thing, not necessarily having to do with reconstruction, but having to do with long-term disaster preparedness and planning. On the reconstruction front, after the Constitution was formed, after the parties switched, the prime ministers switched, it was like admission. In the United States, the administration switches, Obama comes in, he appoints the head of the Forest Service. There are all these appointments that occur, that have to occur, so to speak, that take a while and get sorted out, and that's a natural political process. And then there are some unnatural political processes that accompany that also take a long time. All of that needed to occur, and at the same time, what they thought was already in place, the National Reconstruction Authority, there was already a Nepali Congress appointee in charge of that, who, for all intents and purposes, seemed quite capable, was sort of like himself blockaded and switched out, and they were in the process for a long time of debating at the internal level and stopping the bill required to activate the Reconstruction Authority, to activate the money that was donated, taking the time to put their own political party representative at the helm.
Could you repeat that again?
Okay. Yeah. So the CEO of the National Reconstruction Authority was initially, the framework was set up. There was there was debate earlier, and they finally chose someone who was from the Nepali Congress, who was going to be the CEO of the National Reconstruction Authority. Then the administration changed, and the administration kind of stalled the process, anticipating that change. And then once changed, took time to shuffle the cards and ensure that their own person was at the head of the realm, so the helm of that organization, ostensibly so there could be a more effective coordination between the Prime Minister, as the Prime Minister's office, and the National Reconstruction Authority. The National Reconstruction Authority is supposed to be separate from Parliament. It's supposed to have its own mechanism. It's sort of outside all the ministries and everything. It's its own powerful entity. And importantly, it administers, it makes decisions about the administration of the funds that have been committed, the 4.44 billion plus. And it makes important decisions about the overall policies of reconstruction. The National Planning Commission also has a hand in this. The National Planning Commission also had a regime change, and they're coming up with things like resettlement policies and planning. That there are still gaps that are slowly being worked out, but the National Reconstruction Authority is the central authority. It took until the end of December to choose the new CEO of the National Reconstruction Authority. Once that occurred, it required approval by what was then the Parliament. The Constituent Assembly converted to a Parliament upon the signing of the Constitution, which is interesting. And then the National Reconstruction Authority was allowed to start its work. Now, if you didn't have a fuel embargo, well, whatever it is, if you didn't have an unofficial blockade, an embargo or a crisis or a series of protests, if you had more consistent supplies, hypothetically, finding money on the black market for your own motorcycle or your own vehicle is one thing, but fueling an entire NGO activity, for example, a massive like Save the Children type operation requires fuel. So not only was the official reconstruction hampered by the fuel crisis, but so was the activities of others, or at least it became more expensive in many cases. The government level, and also for the hydropower industry, if you have to mobilize massive resources and you have to do everything in this transparent manner, it's quite difficult to work under those conditions. So things were slowed, things were stalled, political stalling. Now, the National Reconstruction Authority is going out and collecting all new information and doing a survey all around Nepal for who is affected, how so, what the needs are at the current moment, and who should be eligible for certain kinds of government support, which is in some senses redundant, either in a bad or a good or a bad way, to some of the data that was collected prior, and but is something that's been asked for by both the government and the donors. So this process is taking a little bit longer. So now, without exaggeration, you have the National Reconstruction Authority is pledging to begin its formal work on the eve of the one-year anniversary of the earthquake. So 1 year after the earthquake, that $4.4 billion that came in June is finally going to start trickling out. And part of the reasons for this delay have to do with these other, again, these layered social and political disasters that follow the earthquake and the aftermath. Whether it's a calamity or a quagmire, however you want to describe it, these things have extended and attenuated certain types of risks and delays and vulnerabilities and uncertainties for different parts of the Nepali population. And not everyone experiences it equally. If your house didn't fall down around you on the earthquake, then the work of the National Reconstruction Authority is not your priority. It's also, to be fair, the earthquake did not affect all of Nepal evenly. There are 14 quote-unquote earthquake-affected districts. Outside of that, and the other districts across Nepal, which there are 75, they did not experience earthquake with the same severity, and it's not their major concern. Other concerns have to do with the constitution, the delineation of federal states, seasonal monsoonal floods, and which you know well, in other parts of Nepal are more important than the earthquake. So the government is doing its best, we hope, to bring about a response, but there's been these other, Nepal is a long-term entanglement of different slow and long onset crises. So they've been trying to sift through them.
Right, and it's very interesting that you're saying it's, and the phrase you used is kind of long, it's an entanglement of slow and long, different crises.
I don't want to fall into the trope that Nepal is in a permanent state of crisis. And there's been lots of anthropological critiques of the theory of Himalayan environmental degradation, and climate change does not in climate change and climatic volatility does not inflict the same kind of issues on different parts of even the Nepal Himalaya. It's extremely variegated. So I'm not trying to say that Nepal is in a permanent state of crisis, but there are at any given point in time multiple crises that are occurring in different places in spatial and temporal scales and social scales around Nepal. Right. And it is a complex weave.
Right. Yeah, certainly. Just kind of goes back into the idea of complexity and how Nepal in itself is, you pointed out India, and as kind of the neighbor, as one of the possible players in some of the issues that Nepal has to deal with, and so just kind of expanding to that idea. Of course, Nepal is embedded in the Himalayas, and these within the Himalayan region, you've got many different actors that are now kind of participating, and so they're not by themselves. Nepal by itself is not a standalone entity, and that it is being influenced by different, sometimes favorable but sometimes unfavorable interests of bigger neighbors or even competing neighbors, right? And kind of layering that in the idea of thinking about especially your work on hydropower, right? Yeah. Which is one of the central dominating themes within the Himalayas in some ways. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure.
Yeah.
Another PhD topic, but closer to my own. Yeah. So, in the context of energy security and disaster preparedness, infrastructure is incredibly important. Infrastructure development and connectivity is of interest to both Nepal's southern neighbor and its northern neighbor. And Nepal technically only has two neighbors, and both of these neighbors, India and China, were extremely involved in both, prior to the earthquake, in infrastructure development, particularly in hydropower development. A lot of the research sites that I work at are either Chinese contractors or Indian contractors, or are either active or promised in different arrangements. Export projects, the idea of a hydropower future and a hydropower economy, similar maybe to what you see in Bhutan, financed by the export and the sale of power to electricity, a sale of power and electricity to India, is a long-term dream of Nepal. The conditions and the terms of those types of relationships and exports are such that they've been debated in treaties about water and power trade and all sorts of regionalistic agreements for a long time, and it's an extremely contentious topic. All that was set aside for a moment in the context of, or seemingly set aside for a moment in the context of the disaster. India responded, China responded, both contributed an incredible amount to the disaster response in Nepal, and I think in ways that were important and strategic, that perhaps, not to be critical of any other individual countries and nation states that responded from afar, but they made very specific interventions that in some cases were extremely helpful. I'm thinking particularly from the Chinese side of road clearance of the only overland, fully passable transit routes that cross from Nepal into the Tibetan Plateau, basically commercial corridors that go through the Himalaya, in Rasua, where we work and where I've done a lot of research, and in Sindupalchok, where I've also done a fair amount of work and research post and prior and post-earthquake. So in both of these areas, Chinese military teams came into Nepal and cleared the border. The border checkpoints themselves, in both cases, were damaged, are still in the process of being reopened for repair. Rasua is actually, which was at the time of the earthquake sort of just recently opened, has become more open in the wake of the earthquake, whereas Sindupalchok, which was the major port of entry, sort of dry port, so to speak, has been remains damaged and remains less restored and is not open for the time being at the same level of activity. But both of these areas, the Chinese response was extremely important at a local scale. You go to Kathmandu, and at a certain point, all of a sudden, 30,000 or 40,000 Chinese tents appeared in Kathmandu, and it made a significant difference. Immediately overnight, I mean, before that, I was struggling to try to find, there was a shortage of tents, despite all the different efforts. There was a shortage of tents I was trying to find tents for the people of Langtang at the IDP camp, internally displaced people's camp at Phuntsuk Choling Monastery in Kathmandu. And just a week later, you have massive Chinese. You have China Friendship Society delivering a number of tents to a culturally Tibetan population in a Tibetan monastery, which is remarkable for a number of reasons. And overall, at the global scale, it's said, and many people have said this, and I think it's fact. I haven't verified it myself, but at the current moment, the scale of the mobilization from China for Nepal post-earthquake relief is its single largest humanitarian effort outside of its borders in history. Which I think it says something specific about Nepal's relationship to China and its geopolitical position. Perhaps it says something about trade as well, embedded interests. Chinese contractors are working in Nepal. But it also says something about China reimagining its role as a world superpower and participating in its disaster response. I think in the coming years, and India is thinking the same thing, you'll see disaster response teams from places deployed from China and India to places in the Asian theater, so to speak, and in greater intensity. I think that they learned from their efforts in Nepal. But both very considerable. Most of my work is in, because this is where the elevation gradient is, this is where the hydraulic head is. Most of my work is in the northern regions of Nepal, or at least the middle hills in Nepal. My experience of the Terai and the southern Nepal-India border is more limited, and my research just doesn't occur in those places as much. But what I've seen in Rasua borders, the Tibetan Autonomous Republic and China, and I've seen a lot of activity there. So in the post-earthquake context, as you said, there's a bit of conditionality to some of the pledges that have come in, which is embodied or expressed in the blockade itself. India wants to help with post-earthquake reconstruction. It wants to support Nepal economically. It wants to have the special relationship that it was discussing in the years prior to the earthquake. I mean, Modi came in the year before the earthquake and said that Buddha was born in Nepal and offered $1 billion soft loan for infrastructure development. 500 million of that was going to be allocated to a particular hydropower project, which is still being fast-tracked, which is not an export project, which is just for Nepal. So there is all these expressions of good faith that are now made more complex, both by the earthquake and this aftermath. But still, there's this idea of this great game going on in some sense. And I think there are parts of, in terms of long-term infrastructure, I think there's truth in some of these things. India and China can't negotiate directly with one another in some cases, and working through Nepal is helpful, and transit corridors that go through Nepal are less contentious and connecting on the north, and you work from the south. I think those things are playing themselves out slowly. China wants to extend the sky train that's from Lhasa. It's already almost to Shigatse, and eventually the plan is that it'll reach the border of Rasua. The political leadership in Kathmandu is requesting and supposedly accommodating a plan and thinking about it, mulling, they're doing a lot of mulling, about whether or not the railroad will extend all the way into Nepal and can proceed ostensibly, I mean, I don't think it's quite realistic, but all the way to Kathmandu. Nonetheless, Nepal is becoming more permeable on both sides as a result of infrastructure-related interests from both of these major powers, and hydropower is a vector for that, because hydropower is an industry that China has cultivated an extreme specialty in, following the World Commission on Dams and other sort of late 1990s activities, in which Nepal was actually a case study of, in the R13 project, where a lot of global institutions pulled back from big hydro. China stepped in and expanded into, hundreds of countries, but the scale of the Chinese share of the hydropower development market in the world is insane at this current moment. And that's not to say that it's being done poorly. I see all sorts. I mean, one of my long-term research projects, many of my sites are Chinese-involved sites. Some of them, the Chinese are the developer themselves, and they hold the permit. Some of them, they're just a contractor working for a Nepali developer with a Norwegian consultant, so to speak. There are different arrangements of governance and project structure, but overall, I mean, the idea that there's like an evil Chinese hydropower interest that's operating around the world, it's, there's nothing is homogeneous. There's no monolith. I mean, there's a massive state-owned hydropower industry that certainly has, exerts itself as some form of soft power in areas like Nepal. But when you look at the ground, it's not to say that all Chinese hydropower companies are behaving badly or are not concerned about social and environmental issues. I actually find it's extremely variable. Nonetheless, if you have a Chinese hydropower contractor operating in a border area, there's also a likelihood that somewhere along the line related to those projects, it's not business tying, but China has another interest in facilitating, transboundary infrastructure. And in many places where they're building hydropower, they're building roads. And eventually there are plans for 6 major corridors that'll replicate what's already been done in Rasua and Sindupalchok, and it'll go through those areas. There's a paper that I'm currently working on with my 2 colleagues, Galen Merton and Bob Beasley, called A Handshake Over the Himalaya, which is about Chinese investment in transboundary infrastructure. We published hopefully within the year. And that idea of a handshake over the Himalaya was actually first talked about with India, and then later talked about with Nepal. And I've heard it talked about in terms of both hydropower and roads as a way of solidifying friendships. This goes back to, the great metaphor for Nepal as the yam between two boulders. And it's, whether or not it's being squeezed or whether or not it's sort of squeezable quality and resilience, so to speak, is an asset. It's clear that the geopolitical position is both a burden and an asset, or liability and an asset, but it's not always done intelligently, as we've seen lately from certain political leadership. But it's certainly true that Nepal, from time to time, plays that role well, and in negotiating and working the interests on one side and the interests on the other side to its own advantage. And the idea maintains its strategic importance by manifesting the idea that there are these, they're a hot topic and that they're a point of interest for infrastructure development from both sides, which is true. And they're not, and it's not just India and China either. Importantly, the United States, the British, Norwegians, a number of other large-scale foreign entities are trying to support the appropriate hydropower development, so to speak, and improving the capacity of the hydropower sector in Nepal and creating opportunities for foreign direct investment. There's an incredible amount of attention. It's not just India and China, but the technical capacity, because of the proximity, in a lot of cases, it might be a project that's looked at by the Investment Board of Nepal with the support of multiple different organizations from other countries, but the contractor in the end might be from India, or or it might be from China for some of these major projects. The long-term questions of power sharing and transboundary transmission infrastructure, of how to actually evacuate the power, on what terms, where and when, those big questions about, is there a South Asian regional grid that Nepal participates in? To what extent? The big questions are still huge. Hence, what I will be writing some of my dissertation on at Cornell.
Yeah. This is great. I think I have maybe one question, and that's to do with the map that you had produced on all the different dams. And I think it would be great to just kind of speak, in terms, tell us a little bit about the different stages at which these dams are, and at least in terms of, can't go in detail for every dam, but just kind of major stages in where these dams are. How many are proposed? What's, can you see some of these major, or some major learnings or challenges that are coming out from these depictions?
Yeah. So the project that you're referencing is it was developed. I sort of initially conceptualized the idea, and I was working with my partners at the NITI Foundation, which is a policy-oriented think tank in Nepal that looks at hydropower development. We fleshed out the idea further, and then we brought in Kathmandu Living Labs, which has since become famous for its post-earthquake activity. It's a very forward-thinking organization to help us with the technical side of representation and mapping and using this open source platform. So what we did essentially is we created a map of all the hydropower projects that are planned currently in Nepal. That's using official data from the Department of Electricity and Development, from the Ministry of Energy, and coding it in such a way that you can sort it by size of project, by location of project, by you can search by contractor if that's of interest to you as well. You can try to understand. You can't really search by country affiliation of contractor, but you could do the work of trying to figure out, if you wanted to know where all the Chinese hydropower companies were operating in Nepal, you could look at that kind of thing. Most importantly, though, as your question indicates, we're trying to increase the ability of the average Nepali citizen or interested person in general, as an effort of sort of data democracy. We're trying to increase the ability of the average citizen to visualize what the hydropower future that's so often talked about might actually look like. Now, there are many ways to do that. I also take photographs. I think those sort of visual narratives are also important. But at the first level of conversation, to increase the quality of the dialogue, what we're trying to do is represent all the sites where this project's proposed, and you can turn them on and turn them off in layers. Looking as the first layer is, these are the ones that you would see. First layer is these are the ones that have been completed, and we have a draggable timeline where you can move from the past to the present day. You can see where they pop up. The goal is to send that into the future. I'll come back to that in a moment. But the first level of filter is those that have been completed that are already connected to the grid. The second are those that are currently under construction. And there are different, what we would like to do is build out more functionality about sort of crowdsourcing estimations of when these might happen, or like expert opinions, and then populate different matrices of scenarios for when and the power from certain projects will actually come online, so that citizens can start to look at how when they might, what kind of promises about how long load shedding, the current blackout situation, when those might actually change, when there might actually be enough supply to match demand, or to reconsider what Nepal's demand might be. We'll have other scenarios as well. But sorry, getting ahead of myself. To go back, so there's completed, there's under construction, there's construction license approved, which means you're about to break ground, which the people living in the area might know about. There's survey license status, where someone's come around and done measurements. If you're living in the local area, maybe you've been consulted, maybe there's been a public hearing, but it's unlikely that people outside of that area are, unless they're hydropower wonks like myself, are completely aware of the status of that project or when it might begin. You go back further, and there's like survey license applied for, which are sort of at the level of still searching. And there's other processes that overlap with these levels of classification, like financial closure and the actual construction. I mean, the construction process itself, the life cycle of a project is incredibly complex and has many factors. But the rough goal is to be able to allow people in a color-coded fashion to visualize what projects are on the near horizon, what are on the long-term horizon, and then which ones are kind of in question. In addition to the data set from the Department of Electricity Development, we also have some of the largest projects, the mega projects, don't go through this formal registration process because they're negotiated at this larger political level. The projects that the Investment Board of Nepal looks at, and others. So we've added those into the map as well, and those are sort of more uncertain. The status of those shifts with things like earthquakes and blockades, and the Norwegians recently pulled out of a massive 650 megawatt project, which has everybody up in arms. But the reason for that is mainly because of the export market wasn't there, and it was designed as an export project. Well, I won't get into that.
Sure.
But there are the likelihood of certain projects, happening and not happening. And right now, when you read, the majority of information on these things comes from for the typical consumer of hydropower news comes from the newspapers. If you attend industry events or you're involved with the industry, you might have a better sense of it. But otherwise, you just read the op-eds in the newspaper, and there's someone, some sort of polemic against, we need to diminish the barriers to investment. We need to turn on the lights. We have an entire generation growing up in the dark. There are all these really impassioned narratives that that are evocative. And this type of thing that anthropologists loves to study, the dreams of the future, and they're powerful. But the point is to have a little bit more to give people a way to look at it and play with the different variables and think about what are the actual requirements here, and how can we get there, and what projects are moving forward, and what's the quality of those projects. We're hoping to actually also have things like pictures and environmental impact assessments and white papers and things that are relevant to projects
that can be associated.
Tagged, and have more crowdsourced input from people, either on like researchers like myself or on the ground. To actually, a hydropower project, importantly, is not a dot on a map. A dam is not a dot. When you look at a hydropower project, particularly the run-of-the-river projects that exist in Nepal, you have a diversion dam, you have a tunnel that could extend anywhere from 4 to 15 kilometers on average, and then you have a powerhouse. So you're looking at a corridor of the river that's actually being used for that project. To think of it as a dot doesn't work. So once you know where the projects are, the next thing is to go in, and as the project develops or as the plans become more clear, to represent actually where the tunnel might be, which is of extreme importance to people who live near there, or where the tunnel is currently if it's being built, and where the powerhouse is. So that's people looking at it, coming new to the idea of hydropower development in Nepal, can choose their own level of understanding, but the data is there, and is continually also being built from a crowdsourced perspective. Like I said, so far we have a beta product only, and actually it was interrupted by the earthquake. This project we were working on prior to the earthquake in Kathmandu Living Labs has been busy doing other wonderful work, and I've also been busy, for better or worse.
Right.
So this project we're trying to take into the future now and increase different kinds of functionality, but the overall goal is to create an objective and unbiased, to the extent possible, picture that represents the level of project development. To your bigger question about lessons learned, if you look at this map, the current data set that we're working with, there are 521 odd projects that are in different stages of licensure and development. 521, over 1 megawatt. So if you can turn layers off for 1 megawatt to 10 megawatts, 10 megawatts to 25 megawatts. So this doesn't include micro and mini hydro, which are sub 1 megawatt scale, of which there are thousands. These are the ones that are most relevant to the idea of a national grid, over 1 megawatt. If you look at all of these projects and you start to see in a particular river, for example, the Tricity River in Masua, there might be 16 different hydropower projects on the main channel of the river and on some of the side tributaries in a 35-kilometer stretch. If each of those is a tunnel project, and you have seasonal variations in flow, then you can say with almost some certainty that if all of those projects get developed, the river will be in a tunnel for 80% of its course some part of the year in the future, which is a significant change in the flow regime. So, and there are other issues of sedimentation and, as we see, in seismically active region, landslides, not to mention the actual infrastructure and its vulnerability, which we don't have good data on, unfortunately, even after the earthquake. The point here of that is to say, not that we shouldn't develop all those 16 different projects, but you can't consider impacts in isolation. Environmental impact assessments, unfortunately, at this point, are relatively simplistic in most cases. If you have a forward-thinking developer, a best practices sort of developer who's operating with certain donor standards, they might do a fantastic environmental impact assessment. Nonetheless, the monitoring and evaluation mechanisms are weak, but most of the environmental impact assessments are quite weak. And then going forward, not only are they not implemented, but they don't articulate with each other. And if you're going to have 16 different projects on the river over the course of it'll take 20 years and staggered, this one now, that one later, then this one again later, and then that one again, they facilitate each other, access-wise, socially and politically. They build on one another. If you have 16 projects on one river over the course of 20, 30 years, the river is a construction site for 20 years at some point along its course. You need to have a cumulative impact assessment. And I think the social issues that I study in hydropower development, unfortunately, there's a lot of understanding that's, informal understanding around the sector. There's a lot of experience. There's not, in Nepal, the idea of resistance against hydropower projects is quite different than what, you might know about from other projects in other contexts. The majority of people want hydropower and want in some form, and they're looking at these. Importantly, they're looking at the types of benefit sharing, the models that would benefit them, and they're hoping for appropriate and fair and equitable treatment, and they mobilize for that. And sometimes there are unnecessary mobilizations, which occurs everywhere, and there are complaints about that in the industry. But overall, if you're looking at this from a social level, the social part of the social environmental impact mitigation typically falls out, and it's informally understood. There are trends, there are practices, but there's a policy gaps there, and they're seeking to fill some of those now with things like the Sheriff's Policy Act, which is a whole other topic. But one of my major research topics is they've been doing basically IPOs and share offerings for hydropower projects, and then selling them to project-affected populations living in the area, and at different levels of discount and different levels of access. But ideally, it's a form of benefit sharing in the future. Done well, it can be a long-term source of livelihood support to the local community, and it's an equitable if the effects are well understood and socially differentiated. it can be a really powerful mechanism that's very forward-thinking and very new. If done poorly, then it's just a speculative bubble. So there's a need for a more clear policy that's slowly emerging. It's a mistake to think that just because there aren't as many dams as everybody wants there to be, that the discourse on hydropower development in Nepal was not evolved. It's in fact highly evolved. The level of discourse and the level of particularity and understanding and the capacity of the industry is extremely outsized compared to what that's actually perceived as going on. So it's a fascinating time to study these things. But overall, we're hoping that this map and other things like it can increase the quality of conversation, help identify policy gaps, and lead to a greater back and forth, not just between affected and project developers, but between all sorts of people involved and with different interests in hydropower development in Nepal. So we're hoping to build out that map and make it more functional and allow people to look into the hydropower future.
Great. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Alark. It's been great.
Wonderful.